Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm your entrepreneurship tutor, also research tutor, Professor Henry Uwezo of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. Today, out of popular demand and request from my fans, I want to give you another talk on conceptual frameworks. I've already given you a talk on this YouTube, but on request, I'm now giving you another talk in addition to what I already have done. So we're talking about conceptual frameworks. This is particularly for students of research. What is on the screen is a typical standard, if you want, conceptual framework where we have some variables on your left or on my left, all pointing to a single variable on my right. And you can notice that the arrow is one directional. The arrow is pointing to one direction. It is not backward and forward. So this is a typical conceptual framework. But then, what is a conceptual framework? From that source, this source library, educational library in some university, the researcher's understanding, hypothesis, exploration of either an existing framework, model, or how existing concepts come together to inform a particular problem. A conceptual framework shows the reader how different elements come together to facilitate research and a clear understanding of the result. That's one source. Another source says a conceptual framework is a product of a researcher's reasoning or a tentative conclusion. The concepts arrived at are based on a literature review where evidence is still incomplete or theories arrived at are inadequate. It is a synthesis of interlinked concepts that provide a comprehensive understanding of a phenomenon. That is that source. Yes, conceptual framework. We keep asking again, what's a conceptual framework? A visual or written product that explains either graphically or in a narrative form the main things to be studied, the key factors, concepts, or variables, and the presumed relationships among them. That's Miles and Haberman, 1994. Look at that. It is visual or written, diagrammatic or in prose. And the conceptual framework must explain, again, either graphically or in a narrative form. It explains the main things to be studied, the key factors, concepts, or variables, and the presumed relationship among them. You can see clearly here that conceptual framework goes beyond just covering variables. It can be concepts, it can be factors. And finally, and again, that source, a conceptual framework is an analytical tool with several variations and contexts used to make conceptual distinctions and organize ideas. Strong conceptual frameworks capture something real and they do this in a way that is easy to remember and apply. The message you are getting is that conceptual framework come in different shapes and forms. Conceptual frameworks can be written or even drawn. So there is no one universally accepted form in which a conceptual framework should appear. Now, some common conceptual frameworks with clear variables are the following. Look at that. You can see we have some independent variables here, all affecting and dependent variable. In other words, the dependent variable depends on the independent variables. These ones can be manipulated. This can be changed. This can be treated. For example, employee engagement depends on internal communication, which can be either face-to-face, board memos, texting. So all this will affect that dependent variable. Here, we can see again the dependent variables, so that the independent variables going through an intervening variable to affect the dependent variable. Watch again, the arrows are pointing in one direction. Whether here, arrows pointing in one direction, which means one variable causes an effect in another variable. So this cause and effect paradigm. Yes, we can still see here now, independent variable, one direction, dependent variable, but there is a moderator. Here we had intervening, through which all the independent go to reach the dependent. But here we're looking at moderating effect. The relationship between the independent and dependent is moderated by yet another variable. And of course, still more, like this could be, the level of education, income, and spending. So, again, this looks like an intervening variable, independent variable, and a dependent variable. Now, these are some of the common presentations of conceptual framework, and you can see in each one of them we have variables: independent, dependent, intervening, moderating, and all that. But this is not the only way frameworks can be presented. If you look at this carefully, this is like quantitative studies. Now, look at this work examining the factors affecting SME performance, the mediating role of social media adoption. I captured this from an article in Sustainability of December 2020. It was a research done on that topic. And look, the conceptual framework again was the independent variables going through an intervening variable to affect the dependent variable. Yes, very common. So we can see here we have independent, intervening, and the dependent variables. Then I got another work, opportunities and the prospects of doing business in Africa, a case of oil companies. This was from a paper presented at the Academy of International Business, Sub-Saharan Africa chapter, inaugural conference held in 2014 in Nairobi, Kenya. Yes. Look at that conceptual framework. One may argue that there are independent variables, these ones, intervening variable, which is this one, but it looks like the intervening variable itself is being moderated, moderating variables on an intervening, and then we have the dependent variable. Complex, I think. You can now see the normal, direct, dependent, independent, dependent is now being kind of erased. This becomes quite complex, where we have both moderating and intervening working together. Then I got this. Factors affecting farmer migration in Norway, a study based on survey results linked to financial data. Again, it was an article in that journal of 2011. This was an applied research. And this is the form of conceptual framework that the farm and the farmer characteristics, one, direct cause and effect to the farm, is permanent residence for the future, or through one intervening, through another intervening. And this is how they named these variables. That this is the antecedent variable, working through mediating variables to outcome variables. Ordinarily, you would say this is the dependent variable, the outcome variable. These are intervening variables, and these are independent variables. But you see the form it is taking. Not the usual form of dependent, independent directly. Then I got this work, gender and managerial level differences in perceptions of effective leadership, article in Leadership and Organization. That was an article in the Leadership and Organizational Development Journal of 2011. And it was like a conceptual framework for a qualitative study on effective leadership. And there it is. Yes. Look, now it's no longer one direction, the arrows. The impression we get that there is also cause and effect, that these many three variables together affect the effective leadership. But among them, there is itself a relationship. And that this relationship is no longer cause and effect. When we have arrows pointing both sides, it's a dialectical relationship. There is an interdependence. It's no longer cause and effect, where we draw independent and dependent directly. Within what we may want to call the independent, there is also dialectical relationships among them. Quite complex. And then finally, affecting effective leadership. Yes. Here, the clarity of cause and effect paradigm is blurred. One more. Exploring general science questions of second school certificate examinations. Assessment of effects of student learning. This was an article in Electronic Journal of January 2018. Here, the work, a new system of education was introduced. Then the question was, how is it performing? It became a descriptive study. And let's look at the conceptual framework. Look at that conceptual framework. Again, there may be no direct variables as we know them. You see? Look at that. A conceptual framework, the Bloom's taxonomy, through one direction, both leading to the results. You can actually Google this work and read it to understand it yourself. Then there was this, exploring the bee shelters, the contribution of the quarry of Fonba, Republic of Benin. Look at that. That's a conceptual framework. And what we see here, depicted here, is a flow diagram. It's like, you see, one, the arrows are again showing relationship, not cause and effect, interdependence. Interdependence. But again, looks like there's a flow diagram. And therefore here, you can see that what we call dependent independent variables is now completely blurred. This is therefore being another version of how we can present conceptual frameworks. Yes, a working hypothesis can also be a conceptual framework. But what's a working hypothesis? The working hypothesis, first and foremost, a hypothesis or a statement of expectation that is tested in action. It's tested as you work on your research. The term working suggests that these hypotheses are subject to change. They are provisional, and the possibility of finding contradictory evidence is real. In addition, a working hypothesis is active. It is a tool in an ongoing process of inquiry. A working hypothesis is a hypothesis that is provisionally accepted as a basis for and is often used as a conceptual framework in qualitative research. We are proposing the working hypothesis as a flexible conceptual framework and as a useful tool for doing exploratory studies. It can be used as an evaluation criteria, particularly for process evaluation, and is useful for student research because students can develop theorizing skills using literature. Those are not my words. At that source, experts were proposing working hypotheses to stand in or to act as conceptual frameworks. And now, there is this work, an assessment of the motivation component of entrepreneurship policy in the youth, women, and Uwezo funds in Kenya. You can capture it at that source or in the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture Technology Library at that source. This was work done in that area. The conceptual framework was a series of working hypotheses. Like hypothesis 1, the process of formulation of the funds does not fit the proposed 5 steps of formulating a national entrepreneurship strategy. Literature has 5 steps. We don't know, the researcher doesn't know whether or not, or is going to assess whether these funds in Kenya followed that process or not. There is no need to propose a diagrammatic conceptual framework. You can choose to go to hypothesis. Remember, the working hypothesis can change as you go. There are no policy measures within the funds that address motivational component of entrepreneurial policy. You are actually going to discover. It's exploratory, but you use a working hypothesis to assist you to go and discover. This working hypothesis can change as the process goes on. You can start discovering, yes, there are those measures, or no, they are not. Those measures are not there. It may beat logic for us to set a conceptual framework of dependent and independent in this case, although it is not eliminated that it can be done. There are no policy measures within the funds that address the opportunity component of entrepreneurship policy. As experts in entrepreneurship, we know that there opportunity component of entrepreneurship policies exist, but we are saying or hypothesizing that in these funds there were no policy measures. So we're actually going to discover. We would have been done without this hypothesis or without this conceptual framework, but to guide us. Go on and discover. As a conceptual framework, we set out this series of hypotheses. And you see, therefore, that in a qualitative study like this one, in an exploratory study like this one, you may want to select or elect not to use any diagrammatic conceptual framework with variables. Finally, it can be a question of election or selection. Look, factors influencing customer satisfaction in the hospitality industry. Yes, your literature review may give you all those factors: price, service, physical environment, promotion, taste, and we say all these can affect customer satisfaction, and it becomes a quantitative study. But the same study can be qualitative in nature. An exploration of factors influencing customer satisfaction in the hospitality industry, the same. But when approached from the qualitative, you can either elect or select to say, literature has given us all these factors. Literature gave us these factors. You can set out to go and measure the cause and effect, the relationship. Or you can go out and say, we want to discover whether this happens in, let's say, Kenya or wherever you are studying or not. So you make this as a conceptual framework, and this also conceptual framework for quantitative, for qualitative, one under the same title topic. You can see that in matters qualitative, we're saying these may not be the only ones. There could be more. There could be more. So we are going to discover more. So closing it to only these ones can eliminate those that are out there that we have not discovered. And therefore, qualitative study goes probably wider, further, and deeper. Quantitative study has taken this as the only ones that they are going to study because these are the only ones that are known. If there are any other that are not known, then this conceptual framework leaves them out. This conceptual framework says we can go and still see if there are more out there. So, selection or election. One and the same topic, you can elect to do quantitative or qualitative, and the conceptual frameworks will differ. What are we saying? That note that for qualitative and quantitative research, if doing qualitative, make sure your framework doesn't include arrow lines. You know, these are arrow lines. Make sure, if you are doing qualitative, make sure that your framework doesn't include arrow lines, which could imply causal or correlational linkages. Because we can do causal, correlational effect via this conceptual framework, or we can do exploratory via that type of conceptual framework, or indeed even working hypothesis. We can develop a working hypothesis for each and go out there and discover more. So in conclusion, a conceptual framework is an analytical tool with several variations, as we have seen, and even contexts. It can be applied in different categories of work where an overall picture is needed. In qualitative research, it mainly defines the relevant variables and maps out how they might relate to each other. Not all qualitative researches may require conceptual framework. As quoted, picked from this source, it is imperative for researchers engaging in phenomenology or grounded theory qualitative research to recognize that 1, it is also appropriate to start data collection without any prior conceptualization. And B, conceptual frameworks can also come at the end of a study once data have been collected and analyzed. So what are we saying? That not every qualitative research may require a conceptual framework. And even if it requires, it may not require it before you go in the field. It is like saying qualitative research is theory building, is hypothesis building. It is not theory testing. It is not hypothesis testing. So we shall generate that theory at the end of the study, generated from the data to have gathered in the field. And therefore, that may eliminate conceptual framework at the beginning. So, whereas all quantitative research requires conceptual frameworks, particularly diagrammatic cause and effect, diagrams. Not all qualitative research may require hypothesis, may require conceptual framework, particularly in a diagrammatic form of cause and effect, because there may be no variables that we are going to study. Thank you for listening, and I hope I've made clarification in the question that I was asked. Have a conceptual framework day, won't you? Thank you.